He bullied my daughter, so I got my revenge. My daughter's teacher, a man named Mr. Evans, liked to encourage the other kids to call her broken robot because of her stutter. When I confronted him about it, he just laughed in my face. A smug, dismissive little chuckle. He said, "If she can't handle a little teasing, life's going to eat her alive." I didn't say a word back to him. I just stood there, letting his words hang in the air between us. That was 2 months ago. I stayed silent. I planned. That was 8 weeks ago. This morning, Mr. Evans had to be escorted out of his office by district security, carrying his career in a sad little cardboard box. I still remember the exact moment this all started, the day my daughter, Zoe, came home from 3rd grade, looking like her whole world had ended. She stumbled through the front door, her backpack dragging on the floor, and her little face was a mess, blotchy, red, swollen from crying. It was the kind of soul-deep hurt that physically pains a parent to see. I dropped my briefcase and knelt in front of her, trying to keep my own voice steady and calm, even as a hot spike of panic shot through my chest. "Hey, what's going on? Talk to me." She just shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. Um, um, I. The words got stuck, a traffic jam in her throat. This was nothing new. Zoe has had a stutter, a speech impediment, for as long as she's been able to talk. We've worked with therapists, practiced breathing techniques. We have a whole toolbox for days when the words just don't want to come out. But this was different. The stutter was lasting longer, the blocks were more severe, and it was tangled up with a kind of frantic desperation I hadn't seen in a long time. My initial panic cooled into a hard, cold suspicion. Something had happened. Someone had done this to her. It took a full 10 minutes of patient waiting, of me just rubbing her back and murmuring that it was okay, take her time, before she could finally get enough out for me to piece it together. It was a jumble of words. Mr. Evans, laughing, robot, everyone. It wasn't a full story, not even close, but it was enough. It was more than enough to fill me with a quiet, simmering rage that felt volcanic. My first instinct was to get in my car, drive back to that school, and find this Mr. Evans. But I couldn't. Not with Zoe looking at me with those big, terrified eyes. In front of her, I had to be dad. Calm dad. Fun dad. So, I kept my cool and pulled out my usual emergency trick, the one reserved for the worst of days. I grabbed a piece of printer paper from the study and a Sharpie from the junk drawer. With a great deal of ceremony, I scribbled a fancy-looking certificate, complete with a gold star I drew myself. In big, loopy letters it read, "Official certificate awarded to Zoe Mitchell for being the world's coolest daughter." I signed it with a flourish, Dad, head of the Cool Daughter Committee, and handed it to her. A tiny giggle escaped through her tears. It was a start. We spent the rest of the evening in recovery mode. A long bath with one of her favorite glittery bath bombs from Bath & Body Works, her choice of takeout for dinner, extra cheesy pizza, and we watched her favorite movie until she finally drifted off to sleep on the couch, her little face finally peaceful. The next day, my own face was a mask of stone. After I dropped her off at the school's kiss and ride lane, watching her walk toward the front doors with a reluctance that broke my heart, I didn't drive to the base. I parked my car across the street, where I had a clear view of the school entrance, and I waited. After about 20 minutes had passed, when a morning rush of parents and buses had died down, I slipped out of my car and walked onto the campus. I felt like a spy in a cheap movie, my heart pounding as I let myself in through a side door that someone had propped open. I moved silently down the hallway, the cheerful, brightly colored walls feeling like a mockery. I found her classroom, room 12, and stood just outside the door, my ear pressed against the cool metal, the little wire-enforced window giving me a sliver of a view. I honestly had no idea what I was doing, or what I was even looking for. I just had this primal, paternal need to see for myself, to understand what was happening in that room. I just knew I needed to do something. It only took a few minutes to get my answer. Mr. Evans, a man with a bland face and a smug posture, was asking the class a math question. And my daughter's hand shot right up into the air. A wave of pride washed over me, so intensely it almost made me smile. She was scared, she was hurt, but she was still trying. She was still brave. But that pride curdled into pure, unadulterated rage in a heartbeat. Mr. Evans called on her. "Zoe, F4T1000, 300, she managed to get out. She struggled, yes, but the answer was there. She knew it. She was participating. A good teacher would have praised her for trying, encouraged her, given her a patient nod. Mr. Evans was not a good teacher. He chuckled, a small but audible sound, and that was all it took. It was permission. Suddenly, the entire room erupted in laughter. A chorus of cruel, childish giggles. "Hey, Zoe, maybe you should use your words," a boy heckled from the back. "She sounds like a BB broken robot." Another kid taunted, mimicking her stutter. It took every ounce of my self-control, every bit of discipline drilled into me over decades of military service, not to burst through that door and start throwing hands. The only thing that stopped me was the thought of how much it would embarrass Zoe to have her dad cause a scene like that. So I stayed put, my fists clenched so tight my nails were digging into my palms, and I continued to watch. Tears started streaming down Zoe's face. She sank down in her chair, trying to make herself invisible. And the teacher, Mr. Evans, just stood there with a massive, disgusting smirk plastered on his face. "Okay, class, let's move on," he said, as if nothing had happened, as if a child wasn't being emotionally flayed in front of him. That's when my cover was blown. Zoe shot out of her seat and ran for the door, clearly making a beeline for the bathroom to hide. She burst out into the hallway and ran right into me. I caught her, wrapping my arms around her as she sobbed into my shirt. I held her so tight she could barely breathe, and I immediately felt her little shoulders, which had been tense as boards, begin to loosen. I put her down, and she latched onto my hand, her grip like a vice. Without a word, we marched straight to the principal's office. When we walked in, the principal, a man named Wilson with a weak chin and tired eyes, looked up from his computer with mild confusion. I could tell instantly from his placid expression that he was either completely unaware of what was happening in his own school, or he was complicit. I decided to assume the former, for a few more seconds at least. I laid it out for him, my voice dangerously cold and straight to the point. "A member of your staff has been actively encouraging the bullying of my daughter." I expected to see some flicker of urgency, of shock, of concern. Instead, he just sighed, a weary, put-upon sigh, as if I was just another annoying parent with another trivial problem. "What is it about?" he asked, his tone flat. "Her speech impediment," I responded, my grip on Zoe's hand tightening. He had the audacity to lean back in his chair and say, "Well, she should probably get that fixed then." My free hand, the one not holding my daughter's, tightened into a fist so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I was on the verge of saying something I would deeply regret, of losing a career I'd spent my life building, when my eyes fell on the school calendar sitting on his desk. There, circled in red, was an event scheduled for that Friday, the annual school talent show. That single, mundane detail was enough to pull me back from the brink. It was enough for me to unclench my jaw, turn around, and walk away from the situation. Because in that instant, a plan began to hatch in my mind. A terrible, wonderful, theatrical, and deeply satisfying plan. You see, I work as a general at a nearby military base. It's not something I advertise. None of the parents or teachers at the school knew this about me. In a small town, that kind of job tends to garner a lot of attention, and I've always wanted to avoid that, for Zoe's sake as much as my own. I just wanted to be Zoe's dad. But Mr. Evans and Principal Wilson had made that impossible. So now, I was about to shove my rank, my resources, and the full weight of the United States military right down their throats. I let Zoe stay home from school for the rest of the week. I told the school she had the flu. We spent the days baking cookies, building a massive pillow fort in the living room, and working on her talent showpiece. She had written a short poem about butterflies, and she was supposed to recite it. By Thursday night, she was a nervous wreck, begging me to let her pull out. "No, sweetie pie," I told her, my voice firm but gentle. "You got to show them who's boss." I knew she was going to get bullied. I knew they would laugh at her, make fun of her. I wasn't just expecting it. I was counting on it. In fact, the more they teased her, the more spectacular my plan would be. I was using my daughter as bait, and a part of me felt sick about it. But the part of me that wanted to burn that school to the ground for what they'd done to her was much, much bigger. Fast forward to Friday night. The school auditorium was buzzing, filled with parents holding cheap camcorders and restless kids. Zoe was backstage, wringing her hands, her face pale. I gave her one last hug. "You're a butterfly, kiddo," I whispered in her ear. "Just spread your wings. I'll take care of the rest." She was the fifth act. When her name was called, she walked out onto the stage, a tiny figure in a vast, intimidating space. She took a deep breath and began. "The BB butterfly flutters by." She had barely finished her first sentence when a voice from the audience, a snot-nosed little punk from her class, yelled out, "Hey, are you loading or something?" The familiar, ugly sound of laughter started to ripple through the auditorium. I saw Mr. Evans, sitting in the third row, cover his mouth with his hand to hide a smirk. I smiled, because that was the cue. That's when 6 military trucks, full-size transport vehicles, pulled up silently outside the main entrance of the auditorium. On my signal, my men, 8 of my most stoic, intimidating-looking soldiers in full dress uniform, began to file in. They moved with purpose, splitting into 2 columns and marching down the side aisles, their boots making no sound on the carpeted floor. They filled the back and sides of the room, standing at parade rest, their faces impassive, their eyes scanning the crowd. Everyone just froze. The laughter died instantly. Parents sat there, mouths agape, not knowing if this was part of the show, if it was some bizarre organized surprise. The auditorium was flooded with a muffled, confused silence. Zoe, on stage, had stopped, her eyes wide as saucers as she locked eyes with me in the audience. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Continue. She took another shaky breath and started her poem again. She kept stuttering, her voice trembling, but this time, the room was utterly, completely silent. Except for one person. Her teacher, Mr. Evans, who, after a moment of stunned silence, couldn't help himself. A loud, braying laugh burst out of him. It was a sound of pure arrogance and disbelief. In response, one of my soldiers, a master sergeant who was built like a refrigerator, took 2 silent steps forward, marched straight to Mr. Evans's row, and stood directly beside him, staring down at him with an expression that could curdle milk. The teacher's laughter choked in his throat. He shrank in his seat, his face turning a deep, satisfying shade of crimson, and didn't make another sound. As soon as my daughter finished her poem, a beat of perfect silence hung in the air. Then, on another silent signal from me, my soldiers turned as one and filed out as quietly as they had entered. The auditorium doors closed behind them, leaving a vacuum of stunned confusion. Everyone's head swiveled, looking at each other, at me, at Zoe on the stage, trying to process what in the world had just happened. This was then followed by a slow, hesitant, and then thunderous round of applause. Some people were on their feet, cheering. My daughter was beaming, a real, full-wattage smile that I hadn't seen in weeks. Meanwhile, Mr. Evans looked like he was about to tear the room apart with pure, impotent rage. This made me even more amused, and a profound sense of joy filled my stomach. I thought, in that moment of triumph, that the story had ended. But really, it was just beginning, because it turns out that a petty, cruel man like Mr. Evans doesn't just take a loss like that. He had an ace up his sleeve, one that threatened to ruin not just me, but my daughter's life forever. After the show, as we were trying to leave, several parents came up to congratulate Zoe. A few of them gave me curious, sideways glances, clearly dying to ask about the military sideshow, but small-town politeness won out. Just as we reached the exit, Principal Wilson intercepted us, that fake, waxy smile plastered on his face again. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice oozing false cordiality, "could I have a word with you in my office on Monday morning?" "Sure thing," I said cheerfully, my good mood unassailable. Looking forward to it. The weekend was bliss. Zoe was on cloud 9, chattering nonstop about how cool it was when all the soldiers came in. "Nobody laughed, Dad. Not even a little bit." We celebrated with a mountain of ice cream and a movie marathon. For the first time in weeks, she seemed genuinely excited about going back to school. On Monday morning, I dropped her off and then headed to my meeting with Wilson. I wasn't worried. What did they possibly do? Complain that I had effectively, if unconventionally, stopped my daughter from being bullied? When I walked in his office, I was surprised to see Mr. Evans sitting there too, looking like a thundercloud. He refused to meet my eyes. Wilson gestured for me to sit. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, trying to sound authoritative, "what happened at the talent show on Friday was unprecedented." "Was it?" I asked innocently. "You brought active military personnel into a school event without authorization. That's a serious security breach." I shrugged. I didn't see any signs saying no military allowed. They're all tax-paying citizens who wanted to support the arts in our community. What's the problem? Wilson's face started to redden. The problem is that it was clearly an intimidation tactic. Intimidation? I don't know what you mean. I just invited some colleagues to watch my daughter perform. Unlike some people in this room, I said, glancing at Evans, they know how to behave respectfully when a child is on stage. Evans finally snapped. "This is ridiculous. He threatened me. Not a single one of my men spoke to you," I pointed out calmly. "If you felt threatened by someone simply standing near you in silence, maybe that's your own guilty conscience talking." Wilson sighed heavily, clearly out of his depth. "Mr. Mitchell, we can't have parents bringing in military displays every time they have an issue with the school. And we can't have teachers encouraging students to bully a child with a disability," I countered, letting the smile drop from my face. Which, by the way, is a violation of about a dozen state and federal education laws. I've been reading up. That shut them both up. "Mr. Evans has assured me he never encouraged any bullying," Wilson said weakly. "I saw it with my own eyes," I said. "And so did 8 other United States military officers, all of whom would be happy to provide sworn statements if needed. I'm sure the school board, the local news, and the Americans with Disabilities Act Enforcement Office would find their accounts very interesting." The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Mitchell?" Wilson finally asked, defeated. "I want my daughter to be treated with respect. I want Mr. Evans to apologize to her in front of the entire class. And I want a new, clear anti-bullying policy that specifically addresses disabilities, with real, actionable consequences for any faculty member who violates it." I stood up. "I'll expect that apology to happen today." I walked out feeling like a king. Problem solved, right? Man, was I ever wrong. The next couple of weeks seemed fine. Zoe said Mr. Evans gave a half-hearted apology, and the bullying stopped completely. She was happy again. Then, one afternoon, I got a call to report to my commanding officer's office immediately. Colonel Barnes was sitting behind his desk, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "Mitchell," he said, his voice grim. "I received a call from the superintendent of schools. Apparently, you've been using military resources for a personal matter." My stomach dropped. I tried to explain, but he cut me off. He understood the instinct to protect my child, he said, but using my position that way was a serious violation of protocol. "The military is not your personal enforcement squad." He let me off with a formal reprimand on my record, but warned me never to let it happen again. I left his office feeling a mix of relief and unease. I hadn't considered the professional blowback, but at least it was over now, or so I thought. The real nightmare was just getting started. The next day, around lunchtime, my phone rang. It was the school. "There's been an incident involving Zoe. We need you to come right away." My heart hammered against my ribs. I broke at least a dozen traffic laws getting there, my mind imagining the worst. The secretary directed me to a conference room where I found Zoe sitting alone at a huge table, looking small and terrified. She burst into tears the moment she saw me. Before I could even ask what happened, Principal Wilson walked in, followed by a woman in a drab business suit. "Mr. Mitchell," Wilson said, avoiding my eyes. "This is Ms. Taylor from Child Protective Services." My blood ran cold. "CPS? What the hell is this about?" Ms. Taylor stepped forward, her expression professionally blank. "Mr. Mitchell, we received an anonymous report expressing concern about possible emotional abuse and intimidation tactics being used in your daughter's presence." I couldn't breathe. I looked from Wilson's suddenly fascinating shoes to Ms. Taylor's unreadable face. This was Evans. It had to be. He was trying to take my daughter away from me. "That's insane," I choked out. "I was protecting her by creating an intimidating environment for an entire auditorium of children and using your own daughter as the centerpiece of that display?" Miss Taylor asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Put like that, it sounded monstrous. My perfect plan suddenly seemed like the reckless, stupid act of an angry man. She turned to Zoe, her voice softening. "Zoe, honey, can you tell me how you felt when all those soldiers came into your school?" Zoe looked at me, her eyes begging for the right answer. I was scared at first," she whispered. "But then I felt safe, because nobody laughed at me." Miss Taylor made a note. And in that moment, I realized that my grand gesture, my big show of force, had scared my own child. The victory I felt that night turned to ash in my mouth. The interview continued, a blur of invasive questions about my job, my hours, about being a single father. Miss Taylor scheduled a home visit for the next day and left. I was left alone with Zoe, who was now trembling. On the drive home, she was silent for a long time. Then, in a tiny, heartbreaking voice, she asked, "Dad, am I going to have to go away? Like Mom did?" My heart shattered. I pulled the car over, my own eyes burning with tears. "No, es tiepie. Absolutely not. Never. This is just a stupid misunderstanding. I promise you, I will never let anyone take you away from me." I hugged her, but I was terrified. Evans hadn't just punched back. He had gone for the jugular. That night, I called my friend Linda, a family lawyer. She told me to calm down, that CPS deals with malicious reports all the time. But what if they don't see it that way? I pleaded. What if they think I'm some military nut job who's endangering his own kid? Linda was blunt. "Look, the military stunt wasn't your smartest move. But one bad decision doesn't make you an unfit parent. Be honest, be cooperative, and show them you're a good dad." The home visit went as well as it could. Our house was clean. The fridge was full, and Zoe's room was a happy explosion of stuffed animals and books. Miss Taylor seemed satisfied, but she still had concerns about my unorthodox methods. "I believe you love your daughter, Mr. Mitchell," she said as she left. "And she appears to be thriving. I'll be recommending this case be closed." The relief was so immense I almost collapsed. But the problem wasn't solved. Evans was still there, and he had shown how low he was willing to go. The very next day, I confronted him outside his classroom before school started. "I know it was you who called CPS," I said, my voice low and shaking with fury. He just gave me that same smug look. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Listen to me," I said, stepping closer. "If you ever try to use my daughter to get to me again, you will have a very serious problem. And that's not a threat. It's a promise." He just smiled. "Are you threatening me again, Mr. Mitchell? Because that worked out so well for you last time." I walked away, my blood boiling. Later that day, Zoe came home quiet again. Evans had kept her in from recess, telling her that if her dad wasn't careful, things might get a lot harder for her in class. He was using my 9-year-old daughter to threaten me. That was the last straw. No more stunts. No more angry confrontations. It was time to do this the right way. I called Linda again. On her advice, I had Zoe write down exactly what Evans said. I wrote my own detailed account of every single incident from the very first day. The next morning, I bypassed Wilson and went straight to the district superintendent, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Ree. I laid everything out for her: the bullying, the talent show, the retaliatory CPS call, and now the direct threat to my daughter. She listened patiently, and, for the first time, I felt like someone in a position of power was actually hearing me. She immediately approved a transfer for Zoe to another third-grade class and promised a full investigation. I thought the nightmare was finally ending. But Mr. Evans had one more card to play. A few days later, I was called back to the superintendent's office. This time, a lawyer from the school board was there. They presented me with a folder. Evans had filed a formal complaint against me for harassment, and he had provided printouts of emails, supposedly from my personal account to other parents, where I was plotting to destroy his career and even plant evidence. "These are fake," I said, stunned. "They're forgeries." He had hacked my account, or spoofed it somehow. It was my word against his. The investigation into Evans was put on hold, pinning an investigation into me. I felt like I was losing my mind. The man was framing me for framing him. It was diabolical. Linda's advice was clear. We need to find out who this guy really is. This isn't normal. We need to go on the offensive. That night, I called in a favor from a friend at the base and got the number for a private investigator, a discreet ex-military intelligence guy. 2 days later, the PI sat in my living room and laid a folder on my coffee table. Mr. Evans's real name was Charles Morgan. He had been accused of the exact same discriminatory behavior towards students with disabilities at his previous school district. The district had let him resign quietly to avoid scandal. His ex-wife had even cited his concerning behavior toward vulnerable students in their divorce filings. He was a predator who got a thrill out of tormenting children he saw as weak, and he had a history of covering his tracks. Armed with this new information, I went back to the parents I had met. It turned out, after talking to the PDA, I found 3 more parents whose kids had similar stories of being targeted by Evans. One boy with ADHD was constantly punished for not being able to sit still. A girl with dyslexia was humiliated by being forced to read aloud. A boy who had recently moved from the Philippines was mocked for his accent. All of them had complained to Principal Wilson, and all of them had been brushed off. He had been covering for his fishing buddy for years. I compiled everything: the PI's report, the testimony from the other parents, notes from a conversation I had with his former principal, and presented it to Superintendent Ree. Her face grew paler with every page she turned. The IT department quickly confirmed the emails were forgeries traced back to a spoofing service. The house of cards Evans had so carefully constructed came crashing down. 2 weeks later, the school board terminated Charles Morgan for unprofessional conduct, targeting students with disabilities and falsifying evidence in a district investigation. Principal Wilson was officially reprimanded and placed on administrative probation for gross negligence in both his hiring practices and his failure to investigate years of credible complaints. The day I told Zoe that Mr. Evans was gone for good, a look of profound relief washed over her face. She thrived in her new class. Her stutter didn't vanish, but her confidence soared. The school, under a new interim principal, implemented a whole new anti-bullying program. As for me, I learned a hard lesson. My theatrical show of force had been satisfying, but it was a clumsy, blunt instrument that almost cost me everything. The real victory came from slow, patient, methodical work. It came from gathering evidence, building alliances, and refusing to back down. A few months later, Zoe came home from school clutching a real certificate, printed on fancy cardstock. It was for Most Improved Public Speaker. She had given a class presentation on butterflies. "I did a GG good job," she told me, beaming. And nobody laughed. Not even once. I hung that certificate on the fridge, right next to my handwritten one. And every time I look at them, I'm reminded that you don't always protect your kids with fists and fury. Sometimes, you protect them with facts, with persistence, and with a love so stubborn it can wear down any bully, no matter how big they are.